Am I on, Selena?
You are on.
Thank you. Okay. I can't share the screen until you stop sharing your screen. Thank you. Okay, is that good? Everybody see things?
Yes, that looks great.
Great. Okay, just sustainabilities in urban planning and practice. I'm going to be very broad, but I will focus in part of my talk on issues through justice. But I want to give you the bigger picture, really, about this concept of just sustainabilities and why it is more important now than it ever has been over its 20 years life. I want first to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, present and future, and to commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. So let me give you a little bit of history. It's about 20 years ago that my colleague in the UK, Bob Evans, and the father of environmental justice, Bob Bullard, started to think about a different framing for environmental justice, because in many ways, environmental justice was seen at that time as an activist agenda. It was not seen as a policy agenda as such. And yet the emerging sustainability agenda seemed to have an equity deficit. It was devoid of discussions of equity. It was all about environmental sustainability. So we thought, let's put the justice from environmental justice into sustainability. And that's how we got the phrase just sustainabilities. We use the plural because we don't want to be prescriptive and say sustainability will look the same in every place. So the plural means that around a certain set of principles that we can all agree on, sustainability will happen, but it is culturally and relationally different according to place. What we were focusing on in this book as well was the links between environmental quality and human equality. We were thinking about, environmental degradation worldwide. Wherever environmental degradation was happening, we were arguing, it was always in relation to social injustices and human rights violations. I almost defy you to find environmental degradation that isn't, messing up people's lives and is visited upon those who are least able to cope. So what we were arguing was sustainability, whilst there is an environmental component to it, it is in the wider issues of social needs and welfare, economic opportunity, within the limits of ecosystems that we find true sustainability. I could see us legislating for a very green world, but would that world really be sustainable if it were not more socially just? Now, I don't usually advertise other people's books, but I would recommend you read this book, The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone, by two British researchers, and they amassed an impressive 40 years of data worldwide on a range of social issues. The headline of the book, though, is basically that it's not poverty that is corrosive in our society, bad though poverty is. It is inequality that is the real killer. The gap between rich and poor is increasing in many countries, and they found through their data a very strong correlation between the rising gap between rich and poor and a whole raft of social inequalities and social malaises, from teen pregnancies to academic underachievement to domestic violence to incarceration. You name it, it increases as society becomes more unequal. And what they also found, which I find very interesting, is they found that advertising revenues were strongly correlated with inequality. So the more inequality in a society, I'm sorry if you can hear my dog in the background, the more inequality in a society, the higher the advertising revenues. Advertisers love inequality because inequality sells. People start buying to keep up with the Joneses. They want to get into the next group, from the poor to the middle class to the upper, and on and on. It's like an escalator of consumption. And in the book, they call it competitive consumption. Inequality drives competitive consumption. But what does competitive consumption also drive? It drives our carbon footprint. Inequality is a big factor behind climate change. Now, how often do you hear 350.org or Bill McKibben or any of these experts on climate change talking about inequality? They're talking more about the need for sustainable transportation, sustainable agriculture. Absolutely, we need that. But one of the drivers is inequality. So I think if we really want to think about sustainability, and especially just sustainabilities, we need to think about human equality and environmental quality together. Now, in the global north, we separate out these issues. Human equality is Amnesty International, it's those social justice groups, it's those housing groups, and then the environmental groups do their thing. We have failed on social justice and environmental protection precisely because we haven't seen the intersections between these issues. And I think now this coming together of these ideas is really where we can start to be much more productive in terms of environmental and human protections, if you like. So I define just sustainabilities then as the need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And there are 4 conditions inherent in this. We must commit to improving people's quality of life and well-being. We cannot see sustainability as losing out. We need to show people that you can have a better quality of life and your well-being can be better. We need to meet the needs of both present and future generations, not just future generations, as in many sustainability formulations. We need to meet the needs of both present and future generations. We need to see justice and equity not simply as about process equity, procedural justice, and just outcomes. We need to use this word recognition. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, No More Guns. There are many, many movements in the world at the moment, none of which I think has the power that Black Lives Matter does, which are cries for recognition. If we don't recognize the right to exist or to be of certain groups in society, how can we ever do justice by them? So in many ways, I see recognition as a precursor to justice. And various environmental justice scholars, political philosophers like Iris Marion Young use this concept of recognition. It is a precursor and it's very, very important. Conditions 1, 2, and 3 need to be done in the context of one planet living. We need to live within ecosystem limits. So don't go away thinking just sustainability is simply about social justice. It really is about social justice within ecosystem limits. And I just want to make a little cry out to say that this thinking predates very similar thinking in terms of donut economics, Kate Raworth's brilliant visualization. Because if you think about just sustainabilities is inhabiting that safe and just space for humanity. It recognizes there's a social foundation that we must not fall below, but it also recognizes there are environmental limits, an ecological ceiling, which was Johan Rockström and his team in Stockholm's contribution. So the donut is that safe space for humanity. That's also the space of just sustainabilities. Many of you I know will be impressed with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The UN really went out on a limb and really embedded issues of voice, gender, race, equity, indigeneity into sustainability. We can have no more debate about, oh, sustainability is about the environment. Yes, it is, but it's about so much more in addition. Now, being involved in urban planning, I want to give you a couple of thoughts on urban planning that I think are really pertinent to what I'm going to say. One of the most elegant and simple definitions of urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. That's what we do. We manage coexistence in shared space. And this speaks with equal clarity, whether you're talking about environmental, transport, urban ag, housing, or other conflicts, because it reminds us that we don't live in spaces where everybody looks alike, thinks alike, makes love the same, does everything the same. We are all very different. We live in cities of difference. How do we coexist in shared spaces with others who are very different to us? The second point I want to raise is something that is really exercising my mind at the moment. What's the relationship between belonging and becoming? You in urban agriculture, we in the sustainability world, we in urban planning, we're always thinking about how or what our cities can become. They can become more smart, sustainable, resilient, sharing, green, etc. But what we're forgetting along the way is who gets to belong. Who gets to belong in our cities? Who has a right to the city? We're increasingly moving homeless people on. We're increasingly displacing low-income and minority communities through gentrification. We are, in many ways, self-sorting into cities of elites. And if we allow becoming to be decided by those elites, then cities will continue to be elite spaces. How do we balance the desire to become more sustainable cities, a very reasonable desire? How do we balance that with the need for belonging from these groups who are increasingly being denied belonging? And then finally, I also want to just challenge the Congress for New Urbanism, who go on and on and on about human scale planning. Absolutely human scale planning, but I want you to put an E on human. I want to see humane scale planning for reasons which will become apparent when I go through my 3 examples. First of which is spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? Second, I want to talk briefly about Minneapolis. How does one of the most green liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism following the horrific death of George Floyd in May last year? And then for you foodies, I just had to put in a little delicious something. Food justice. What is local food in intercultural societies? I'm going to challenge you with that. So let me just quickly go through this idea of spatial justice. Not many cities in the world now have walls across them. Jerusalem does, Belfast in Northern Ireland used to, Nicosia in Cyprus does. But in most US cities, though, there's a railroad, a creek, a freeway, there's something. And on one side they live, and on the other side you live. Their lives are shorter, their life opportunities are circumscribed. That's spatial injustice. We have a patchwork quilt of opportunity and hazard in our cities, and we know who has the opportunity and who has the hazard. But let's bring this idea of spatial justice down to the street level. 2 streets, one in Sweden on the left and the other Cambridge, Massachusetts, Massachusetts Avenue. Streets are identical width, but they could not be more differently organized spatially. The Swedes have done what I call democratize the street. They've given equal access to space to people irrespective of whether they're walking, cycling, on a streetcar. To the left of the streetcar is that little piece of the street that is open to private vehicles. Not so much in the US. In the US, your access to road space is predicated on 2 things. 1, having a vehicle, and 2, having a bigger vehicle than somebody else, because size trumps in access to road space. Now, to be fair, and this is Cambridge, Massachusetts, one of the most liberal cities, which is where I live. Now there are bike lanes, protected bike lanes on this street. So this was taken several years ago. But I think the point is made here. And what I want you to think about is, you're a kid growing up on one of those 2 streets. How are you wired differently? On one street in Sweden, you come out into order, democratized access to urban space. And on the right, it's much more dog eat dog, survival of the fittest. What messages, like the hidden curriculum, what messages does that street give you? Now we have some data, and the data shows that on lightly trafficked streets, people have much more interactions, acquaintances, friendships across the street. On heavily trafficked streets, not so much less interaction. And this work was done in San Francisco in the late 70s and early 80s. What's the Just Sustainabilities take here? Where do the low income and minority groups live? They live on heavily trafficked streets. They are likely to be in streets where social interactions and even interactions with vehicles. I mean, we know that Asian American, African American, Latinx, Native Americans are much more likely to have road traffic accidents, and they are more likely to be fatal. So the just sustainabilities aspect of this spatial justice theorizing that I'm doing here is that many neighborhoods in low income areas are more hazardous in terms of spatial justice. But you know, there is some good news. Mayor Bloomberg hired Janet Sadiq Khan as his transportation commissioner. She brought in Jan Gale, the guy that really masterminded the Copenhagen miracle. And they enlisted the support of the transportation justice groups within New York. And here's the result. Look at that outside of Macy's. Just think to yourself, would you ever have thought that you were going to see that in New York City? And it brings out a principle here. Urban planning, sustainability should be about what is possible, not what is probable. If we keep doing what we've probably always done, we'll definitely stay in this tired, old, trickle-down paradigm where the rich get their piece and everybody else has to scrabble for the rest. We need to think of sustainability in urban planning as being about what is possible. I mentioned this concept of spatial injustice because I want to show you how people in my city building profession can be inhumane. And this is why I want to see humane planning. We can put studs, top left picture, studs on the edges of walls to stop those teenage skateboarders. We can put armrests on benches. We paint them nice colors, you know, to make them look homely, but then we put armrests to stop homeless people. Architects can design studs into building spaces where homeless people just want to get some warmth. I find that unconscionable that we can have designers who will do that. It's like, you know, you see these little spikes to stop pigeons landing on ledges. We're doing this to people. These are human beings. We also build buildings where there is a requirement for low to moderate income units, and then we put doors in the back alley for them, and then the rich just go straight up in their elevators to the penthouses. The rich door, poor door issue. Bottom left, we have a bridge in Seattle. There are no homeless people there now because the city put cycle racks there to deter homeless people from being there. Thankfully, the Seattle cycling community said, look, Seattle, we've got a problem with homelessness, but do not use sustainability infrastructure, do not use cycle racks to try and deter homeless people. This requires policy and resources, both of which the city has. Let's do something. Now, one other way of thinking about spatial justice would be to think about how we move around cities. And, you know, you think about yourself. We move around cities and we studiously avoid eye contact with other people. But my friend Elijah Anderson at Yale argues that there are certain parts of cities, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies, where people let down their guard. We're humans. These might be food spaces, markets. This one, the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. People across gender, racial, sexual difference, sit down, watch some sport on TV, eat various different foods, and they talk. The importance of cosmopolitan canopies cannot be understated because they illustrate a principle called contact theory. The more contact you have with people who are different from you, the more likely you are to be tolerant, empathetic, and even desirous of more interracial contact or intercultural contact for that matter. Will cosmopolitan canopies counter racism? No, they won't. But they are a way of eroding people's fears about each other. They are spaces, they are safe or brave spaces where people can talk across difference. So I have a question, and I usually give this talk to urban planners and designers, but is there a role for us as urban planners and designers in creating cosmopolitan canopies? Are your urban ag or is your community farm a cosmopolitan canopy? Is contact theory working there? Are people coming together across difference and thinking about how we relate to each other? An urban planning, urban design tool that is increasingly being used is complete streets. The idea that let's decenter the automobile that has held a sort of kingpin position on streets for too long. Let's decenter the automobile, let's recenter the active transportation modes of cycling and walking. And we have complete street designs from every city, every municipality, literally in the US has these complete streets manuals. But I want to ask you, what is a complete street really? The bottom right picture shows, an ambitious design from an urban designer, and then on the bottom left shows you a street. You cannot design that street. Yes, we can have the physical space that we call the street designed, and it was designed by an urban designer or a planner or an architect, but there is a social ecology to that street that cannot be possibly replicated through a designer's pen. Doreen Massey, the late great geographer, said places, and I see streets as places, have no meaning, rather they are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. Streets are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. But most of our urban designers who design complete streets don't know that. They are physical designers. They haven't done anthropology or urban ethnography. They need to do that. So what's now happening is this physically focused complete streets design is rather unjust because it disconnects streets from social, structural, symbolic, discursive, racial, and historical realities. And, a really good example of this is Los Angeles. Believe it or not, LA, the, motor metropolis, is and has many complete streets policies and programs in practice. But, and this goes back to my point about what is a complete street and who gets to decide, there are two huge ethnic cultural groups in Los Angeles, Latinx and Southeast Asians, for whom street food is one of their ultimate cultural expressions. Until recently, street food vending was banned in LA. How does a multicultural metropolis call itself a place where complete streets policies are being enacted when it denies Latinx and Southeast Asian people the right to do what their culture, what their cultural proclivities are? Now, good news, last year LA City Council voted to permit street vending, but not for the right reason, not for the complete streets reason, just because, and it's a good reason, just because they didn't want ICE enforcement to come and pick off people for doing something illegal, street vending, and then deport them if their papers weren't in order. Now, one of the other big problems with complete streets is when complete streets move into complete neighborhoods, into complete areas of cities, we get gentrification, we get greenlining, the sustainability equivalent of redlining, where neighborhoods of tree-lined bump outs, cycle lanes, all of the schmear that can go on in these complete streets. And in my book series, Routledge, the Equity, Justice and Sustainable City series, the first book, which is mine, is called Incomplete Streets. Again, this is my critical planner notion here. How can we have complete streets if everybody isn't being consulted about what that street should look like? The book on the right, Green Gentrification, actually talks about how these green neighborhoods are actually whiter. There's a lot of evidence that complete streets, greenlining, is leading to whiter neighborhoods, not because of racism, but because they are expensive to live in. And socioeconomic factors, as you know, in the United States, are very, linked to racial factors. So one of the problems that we talk about in Incomplete Streets is that we are, it seems, systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized our cities for the last century or more. And, you know, let's think about complete streets, and let's think about what the key urban sustainability metric is, and that is walkability. How walkable is your neighborhood? Walkability says a lot of things about safety, security, about access. There's a lot in that one metric of walkability. And of course, there's an app for that. It's called WalkScore. And when I tell you who owns the app, you may not be surprised. It's Redfin, the online realty company. So let's just take stock here. The key measurable for urban sustainability, walkability, is measured by an app that is owned by a real estate company. We have compromised and commodified sustainability now so that you buy into sustainability. Don't get me wrong, I want walkable, complete streets neighborhoods for everybody, irrespective of the right to pay. But in the US, it's all about the right to pay. Moving on quickly, I want to talk a little bit about urban parks, because again, these are spaces in cities that we need to think about in terms of spatial justice. How do we think about design and management and programming of parks? Because Seth Lowe, in this quote, argues that patterns of design and management, and I would argue programming, exclude some people, reducing social and cultural diversity. Let's think of who the parks designers are. The parks managers, the parks programmers, do they look like the communities that they serve? This would be an excellent project for what I'm really becoming interested in, and that's the notion of co-production. How do we co-produce, co-design, co-manage, co-program parks along with communities? Wouldn't we have better parks? Wouldn't we have more culturally inclusive spaces? Wouldn't we have more contact theory? Wouldn't we have people meeting each other across difference? There's a great report from 2004 by Lanfer and Taylor for the Barr Foundation in Boston that looks at immigrant engagement in public open space, and it posits something that is actually really happening. This year, we will have an election in Boston, and there are two women of color, females, who are up for election. Boston is now a majority minority city, but if you went to some of the Friends of the Park organizations, you wouldn't know that. They are resolutely old Boston, white, very wealthy. How do we think about the management of spaces when these Friends of the Park organizations are really remnants of the past, and we have a new city that is looking to a future of interculturalism? How do we do that? And how do we engage newcomers to Boston, new residents? How do we engage them in public spaces? Well, in many ways, they're doing it already. And this quote from a Guatemalan American in Alston, Brighton in Boston says, I think one of the reasons that that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park because it looks like home. Familiarity is really important to immigrants. They tend to congregate in places that are familiar, whether it's the restaurant, whether it's a landscape feature, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. In Copenhagen, they've taken a slightly different approach and tried to design in encounter in Superkilen Park in the very heavily immigrant Nørrebro district of Copenhagen. The park is full of artifacts from different cultures, from Mexico to Russia to Ghana to Venezuela. It's like walking through an open museum of artifacts. And it's a way, again, of bringing people together. Oh, that's from your country. What does that symbolize? You know, it's contact theory. It's designing in encounter. I really want to make a strong plug here for deep ethnographies. As urban planners, what we tend to do is we look at demographic data. Oh, that neighborhood is 20% Latino, 18% African American, X percentage. What does that tell us other than a relational amount of people compared to other people. Deep ethnographies tells us about the culture, the ideas, the fears, the hopes. Could we co-produce deep ethnographies between urban planning departments and community? Well, of course we could. And this particular group I want to talk to you a little bit about is the Department of Landscape at the University of Sheffield in England. They have a transnational urban outdoors research group. They've been looking at ideas for refugee integration and well-being in parks in the UK. They produced a brilliant paper, which, if any of you want to get, go to the journal Local Environment, the International Journal of Justice and Sustainability, of which I'm editor-in-chief. The paper is called Ethnographic Understandings of Ethnically Diverse Neighbourhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. It's a brilliant paper talking about how ethnographic information can be translated into design practice. Absolutely amazing paper. Okay, second piece I wanted to talk about was the Minneapolis paradox. So folks, I don't need to tell you, Minneapolis is a green utopia. 10 years running, it's had the best urban park system in the US. It's one of the best cities in the US for exercise. It's the city with the third most bike commuters. It's a miracle. No place mixes affordability, opportunity, and wealth so well. That is if you're white. If you're not white, it's not so good. This is the paradox. This is the unjust sustainability, if you like. Racial inequality in Minneapolis is among the worst in the nation. The income gap is at or near the highest in the nation. The wealth gap, the intergenerational wealth gap, which is usually measured by home ownership, is the worst in the nation. The achievement gap, the opportunity gap between white and African American and white and Native American is among the highest in the nation. So on the one hand, we have a green utopia. And if we were just to measure the city's progress by green metrics, we would say it's doing very well. But if we take a just sustainability's point of view, Minneapolis is not doing too well. Another city that's not doing too well that's super green is Portland, Oregon. Super green, people flooding to Portland. You know, it's where young people go to retire, white kids with dreadlocks, that kind of place. It's a great place. But underneath that greenery is a deeply unjust system. Now, why? And we could look at this, the same reasons for every US city. Kirsten Delegard, who's a Minneapolis historian and founder of the Mapping Prejudice Project, she says all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures darker truths about city. What are those darker truths? Well, here they are. In the 19th century, there were a small but evenly spread population of minorities, especially African Americans in Minneapolis. And then something happened in the early 1900s. Racialized covenants came out. Documents, legal documents about who could rent and own homes. These persisted till the 1960s, but actually, I mean, they're still around, just not written. It's all done by word of mouth, so that it's not, it's not traceable. Until 1917 in the US, racialized zoning was active, started in Baltimore. And after that, the Supreme Court struck it down. So what did people do? They entered into an agreement to go for single family zoning. Again, using socioeconomics, because they knew that if you do single family zoning, you would literally stop low income and minorities getting into your neighborhood. And interestingly, around those much vaunted parks in Minneapolis are what are called racial cordons of single family zoning to stop access to the parks to non-white folks. 70% of land in Minneapolis is zoned for single family. And then you got redlining, of course. So racialized covenants, racialized zoning, then exclusionary or single family zoning, redlining. The result is quite specific racial segregation then and now. Only one country in the world did it better than us in the United States, and that was apartheid South Africa. So what now? Well, Heather Worthington one of their long-range planners, acknowledges the direct link between those practices and where we are today. I'm much more forthright, I think, in my assertion. Urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So what is Minneapolis doing? Well, it was the first city in 2018 to end single-family zoning. Now, developers can build duplexes and triplexes on single-family zoned land. We've got inclusionary zoning, where at least 10% of units have to be affordable to low and moderate income people. The Minneapolis 2040 plan is bold, but it needs to be bold. And the point is, it's an activist, progressive, young, green, democratic elected government there. So the first key point that they want to make is we need to eliminate disparities. All communities should thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. This can be done, and Minneapolis is, I think, on the way to doing it. Just one other point I want to make, and to link in with George Floyd, 93% of Minneapolis police officers don't live in the city of Minneapolis. They come in. In Boston, if you are a teacher, an EMT, or a police officer, there is a residency requirement. I'm not saying Boston police are any more gentle than Minneapolis police, but think of a de-escalation situation with a group of youths and a group of cops. Somebody is going to know a brother that went to school with that kid, and there's the chance for de-escalation when you've grown up in the same community, a chance for de-escalation. But it raises a broader point. If your organization doesn't look like the community it serves, are you legitimate? Are you trusted? Or are you even effective? And that's whether you're an urban planning department, whether you're a police force, or you're a food justice non-profit, because there's a lot of food justice non-profits that are not looking like the communities, which is a good segue into my last few comments. And again, a book opportunity here. The psychologists tell me, if I leave this on for 45 seconds, 20% of you will be on Amazon within about 2 minutes buying this book. So let's just make sure I keep it on for 45 seconds. And yes, okay, I can move on. There's a great story here. 2011, National Public Radio, and I was absolutely entranced with this story. So George and Julia Bowling, and I Googled them recently, and sadly George passed, but they are tobacco farmers in Maryland. State of Maryland's been trying to get people out of tobacco farming and to diversify, and being good American entrepreneurs, George and Julia were looking around thinking, what can we grow? And then they had an idea. 120,000 Africans living in the DC area, upper middle class people, diplomats, lawyers, professors, doctors, and they want to eat locally grown African food. They don't want it flown in. They don't want it frozen. They want to come out to Maryland and pick food. So now the signboard to the Bowling farm says African produce. The University of Maryland Extension Scheme got in on this and did some work with the Bowlings and the African community to find out what will grow. They developed a resource pack with recipes and all the sort of cultural information. Very interesting. So what are local foods in an intercultural society? If the Africans in DC want to eat local food, who are we to say that they shouldn't grow their food? And one thing here, look, I'm a geographer. There is no such thing as local. There's no geographic definition of local. There is no signboard when you're leaving your town saying you are now leaving local and you are going regional or whatever. There's nothing like that. What the Africans here are doing is applying a cultural local or even a translocal. They're bringing with them their locality. The Willows and Guatemalans, bringing your food here. The Filipinos in San Diego, who, when asked by this PhD researcher, what is local food? They said, well, it's the food we grow in our yards, and it's the food we eat in our restaurants. Translocalism, food, the familiarity of place are very, very, very important to immigrants. We need to remember that. In Metro Vancouver, and I noticed there's one or two people from Vancouver, nearly 20% of farmers in the Metro Vancouver region are Chinese Canadians. And one of the very interesting things is they don't use the farmers markets, the largely white middle class farmers markets. They've set up their own parallel network of markets. And I gave this talk in Vancouver about 10 years ago, and a young Kenyan woman came up to me afterwards and said, Julian, that was fascinating. I always go to the Chinese farmers markets because they sell the food that I want to buy. Chinese entrepreneurialism, anti-Chinese racism in Canada has really, in effect, created a parallel local food network. So two challenges that I've given you here. One is to the very core concept of local, which is at the very core of the alternative food network, a challenge to the concept of local, and then a challenge to the main economic locus of the alternative food network, which is the farmers market. So in both cases, we can see some people see these with different lenses. I mourn the loss of South Central Farm in LA, which was the biggest urban farm in the United States, and is now defunct. I think it was about 2006, 2007. It was 96% Latinx farmed. And I want to take this idea a little further of local and familiar. These women are not just growing culturally appropriate foods. You can see the cactuses forming the field boundary. Their garden is laid out exactly as it was in Oaxaca. And, you know, the quote I just think is wonderful. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home. This makes us feel like who we are. It allows us to keep a piece of who we are after coming to the United States. The willows, the food in DC, the food in San Diego, the autotopographies that are being created by these Latinx farmers. It's placemaking. People want to feel part of a place. And you, who are interested in sustainable agriculture, you are placemaking as well. How can you placemake around immigrant wants and desires? And the penultimate slide I want to show you is about 50 farms that occur around the country. This is New Roots Farm in San Diego. My own university, Tufts, has a farm in Lowell, Massachusetts called New Entry Farms. Immigrants, refugees, local farmers all meet, and there is great cultural interaction around food. And this is, you know, in many ways what I call the new agriculture. These are the new agriculturalists, no different from the Scandinavians and the Germans and the Dutch that farmed the Great Plains a couple of hundred years ago. I couldn't leave without a plug for my latest book. If you're interested in immigrants and food and the close links between food policy and immigration policy and the role of food in the daily spatial practices of immigrants, then this would be a book for you. So let me summarize. Just sustainabilities means managing our coexistence in shared space. We need to think about fostering belonging as well as dreaming about what cities can become. We need to foster engagement and belonging using deep ethnographic knowledge, which can be co-produced with communities. We need to engage in intercultural, country competent planning and policy making. We need to practice humane scaled and human scaled urban planning and design. And above all, social justice never simply happens in planning processes and outcomes. It must be intentional, implicit, and front and center in our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking and inspiring talk. I'm going to pass it on to my co-host, Professor Will Valley at the University of British Columbia, who's going to facilitate the question and answers.
Thanks so much, Selena, and thanks so much, Julian. I have a lot of questions written down, but the chat was quite active, and so I imagine there's a lot of folks who have questions. So I'd like to open the floor right now. So folks, you can write in the chat and I can read out, or you can unmute yourself and jump right in. I think we have you for another 10 minutes or so, Julian?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll, so if you have questions, start. I'll give it a few moments to unmute and jump.
Colin, I know you have a question.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also happy. Well, I might quickly start then. Julian, one of your papers back in 2012 with Jennifer Erickson talked about the importance of cultural competency in planning education. And we relied on that paper for our recent paper, 2020. So we were about 10 years behind you in our kind of food systems education work. Wondering how that paper was received by your colleagues. Like, what type of chatter did it create? Did people engage with you? And where does it stand now? Have you seen much development since then? Because you did point out very clearly 10 years ago that we needed to start focusing on this and planning.
Yeah, well, so great question, and glad to. It's always great when people use your work. It really is. I mean, this is why we do this. So, well, several points here. Number one. The planning profession doesn't look like the communities it serves generally. So cultural competency is even more important. We found that social workers, urban healthcare professionals all have cultural competency as part of their code of practice. Why wouldn't urban planners? That was our premise. It was received very well. Has there been much change? I keep banging on the door of the American Planning Association, and there is some movement, but you see, planners have been laboring under the idea that because they've got social justice and equity in their code of practice, that is the same as cultural competency. It isn't. I know some people who are super duper into social justice and equity who've done very, very culturally incompetent things. And often people, when you talk about cultural competency, they say, oh, no, we need to be anti-racist. Yes, we do, but we also need to be culturally competent. We've kind of sidelined, and maybe it's because cultural competency sounds so managerial. I like the word cultural humility. We need to be humble in front of different cultures. We need to show that we need to listen and learn about those cultures. Because, I could say to you, well, I'm level 5 cultural competency. I can't talk to you. You're only level 3. I hate that idea of quantifying our level of cultural competency in many ways. But we do need it. And especially, given the increasing difference and diversity in our cities. And just let me finish on one point. Some research showed that about 80% of the population would really like to be more culturally competent, but they are afraid to try and do it. 10% of the population don't want to do it. They're called the Proud Boys. About 10% of the population are already culturally competent, but the vast majority of people would love to be more culturally competent. We have to simply think of ways of helping people just understand different cultures and the do's and don'ts. I've seen some horrifically incompetent things that people have done because they just haven't bothered to understand what different cultures do and don't do. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think Colin has a question. Go ahead,
yeah,
Colin.
Thanks so much, Julian, for this talk. It's a pleasure to finally see you. I contributed to your Immigrant Food Nexus book, so very grateful to be a part of that process, and thanks for sharing all of this. I think a logical segue question that comes up for me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, given who's present at this Zoom meeting, is what do you think is the educational task? Like, what is the role of education? I know I'm thinking of it from planning education, but also food systems education. And we really don't see central to those educational efforts equity, cultural competency, they really seem to be tack-ons. Yeah,
Colin, really interesting, because I spent a year, 2017-18, as visiting professor on sabbatical at McGill in the School of Urban Planning, and and I did my thing, and students were just, oh my God, we've never heard anybody speak about urban planning in this way. And then one student said, I'm in an urban design class, and we had, we're now 3 classes into the semester, and several of us asked the professor, when are we going to talk about equity and social justice? And he said, oh, we'll get to that. How often have you heard the we'll get to that? What did I say on my last words on the last slide? Social justice doesn't simply happen. It needs to be front and center. It needs to permeate the curriculum. It doesn't need to be just one chapter in a book on urban agriculture. It needs to permeate all the chapters. It needs to permeate all the chapters on a book on urban planning. So I think, my thought, and we're going through this at Tufts at the moment, we're trying to move away from what we're calling the champions model of equity and social justice, where, oh, we know Julian will do it, or Anna will do it, or such and such. How do we move from champions to the mainstream so that everybody sees social justice and equity in their curriculum, in their cultural competencies? How do we do that? Because at the moment, equity and social justice still do reside, I think, in the minds of those champions who are prepared to go out on a limb. And I'm lucky I have a box to stand on now and shout about these things. But one thing that's really interesting, actually, just on this, is I've had a lot of emails from students from 20 years ago when I first started teaching my Just Sustainabilities class. And to a person, they've all said, it was really interesting then 20 years ago, but I really understand what you're trying to say now. Because 20 years ago, we were in a different situation. But now, this last couple of years has really revealed some, unpleasant things about our society and our societies. So, yeah, it's been, it's something that we need to mainstream rather than just allow champions to carry the emotional labor of doing that.
Thank you. I think Andrea Clark, you had a question in the chat, but also, is there one you'd like to?
I have so many questions. I studied urban anthropology and then urban planning, so a lot of what you're saying, I completely resonate with and felt the lack of it in my urban planning coursework. But one of my big questions is kind of on the practical side of planning, now that I'm doing policy advocacy, is while we're advocating for things like complete streets, bike ped, transit-oriented infrastructure, parks, things like that, knowing that it's Black and Brown communities that bear the brunt of the lack of access or have higher, pedestrian fatalities, doing that in a way that is equitable and just and doesn't just jack up property values and displace people. What other policies or practices would you suggest to go alongside those efforts so that they benefit the communities that are there and don't just displace them?
Look, great question. And look, the high level answer is a quote from the great geographer David Harvey, who said, "We're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in." That's the bottom line at the moment. Cities are about investment, and you in Vancouver can see that. I can see that in the half-full condo towers in Boston, or when I go to London. That's what we've done. We've made the city an investment vehicle rather than a home for many people. And so the least able are then displaced. Belonging, in my terms, is denied to them. At a more local level, there are some varyingly effective anti-gentrification tools. Some of you will have heard of the concept of just green enough. If you Google the concept, or anybody who goes to the American Association of Geographers conferences, there's a whole stream now on just green enough. So the idea came out of Brooklyn, and it was a low-income white Polish community largely who said, look, we don't want the super greening thing doing here, because if you do that, then we'll get all the coffee shops coming in and the restaurants. We just want a public health cleanup. Just clean up the neighborhood so that it's just green enough. Okay, so that's one thing. Work on the Atlanta Beltline, and you'll know, if any of you are interested in gentrification, the Atlanta Beltline is causing a huge amount of gentrification. But research from Georgia Tech has shown that what we need is affordable housing, robust affordable housing policies in place before these projects have happened. And remember, gentrification is happening probably 5 to 10 years before these projects happen. So we need, period, robust affordable housing policies. Some work coming out of Macalester College is talking about patient capital. Capital that is not just in and out with a quick return, which is what a lot of developers want these days. This is capital that is prepared to stay in the community for 10, 15, 20 years, often coming from credit unions, community banks, that kind of thing. That's what we need. And then finally, what was the other one I was thinking of? Oh yeah, community land trusts have worked in the past. I'm not so sure that community land trusts are going to work so well now. I'm thinking of Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston, where, you know, I mean, talk about organizations that look like the community. They did a demographic survey in the 80s before they set up, and they constituted their board of directors to look like the community. That's why they are legitimate, effective, trusted by the city, by foundations. They've got now the Community Land Trust arm has got 2 farms on. They've developed affordable housing, etc. So there are stopgaps, but until we overturn Harvey's notion that we're creating cities for people to invest in, not to live in, then, you know, I think it's game over in many ways until we change that. And how that changes, you know, I'm not so sure. But I do think powerful mayors could make big inroads there, you know, requiring residency in these condos. Otherwise, the city will put homeless people in there. And I don't mind saying, and I see there's a couple of people from Boston here, I'm all in on the Wu train here. I'm backing Michelle Wu. If anybody has, oh, Annalise, well done. Yeah, thank you. Go to Michelle Wu's website, have a look at her food justice agenda for Boston. It is incredible. Now, I helped her with it a little bit. And one of my students was one of the main architects behind it. But she says food justice is racial justice. She locates local food systems as being imbued with white supremacy. When have you ever heard a politician in the US really nail it? Now, if Michelle becomes mayor, we might start to see some real change in housing policy. You know, mayors have got to develop some backbone and really protect their citizens. And, you know, look, Mayor Walsh was a good mayor, but he juggled between the needs of property developers, the unions, and largely white concerned citizens. We need a mayor with a philosophy like Michelle Wu's that is really to take back the city. To what extent she can do that in reality is a very interesting question. I can stay for a few more minutes, actually. Initially I thought I'd have to jump off at 5, but if people want to stay for a few more minutes, I'm good with that.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, and they're having a few things written. So I'd love to open the floor so folks can ask questions directly. I feel like I might misinterpret some of these questions.
I may jump in if I can.
Thank you.
I really loved your talk. Thank you so much. I'm Anna from the American Museum of Natural History. And I haven't had because I never thought I would speak because this is not my expertise. I haven't really articulated my question very well, but I've been thinking about the issue of connection to place and how we want people to feel a connection to place in urban places where you have a lot of populations or immigrants like me who have shallow connection to place. And so you spoke about the local and the fact that perhaps the local is what we bring with us. It's partly our cultures as well. But how do we somehow then harmonize that with also a growing connection to place?
Are the two mutually exclusive?
No.
Remember the quote that I gave you from Doreen Massey, places have no fixed meaning. They are the result of changing social relations through time. Places change. Things are fluid. And, I mean, at the moment, there's there's some dismay in New York over the loss of Jewish delis. Jewish delis are disappearing and other stores are coming in. Places are the products of social relations through time. A lot of the Jewish families have moved out to different places. Immigrants come in and they enrich, and then they move to different places. I don't see it as a binary, translocal or local. Which do you want? I think we can have both, and they both operate and cooperate at the same time.
Thank you.
Can we just jump in and ask a question?
Yes, please.
Hi, Julian. This is Gina Thornburg. I'm in Los Angeles now. So I'm just going to read the question I asked in the chat box.
Yeah.
In LA, there are many conversations around ideas coming out of Sacramento, identical to the inclusionary zoning model adopted in Minneapolis, namely replacing single family lots with split lots and quadruplexes. But these plans do not, at least we suspect they will not produce affordable units here in Los Angeles. They produce expensive rentals, further deepening inequalities. LA has many small, older, modest single-family homes, and they offer the opportunity as starter homes for people of modest incomes. These areas will be first targeted by real estate speculators to take advantage of the densification with quadruplexes. How can these plans to densify ensure that the results help lower income people build wealth, such as happens with starter condos and small homes, rather than continue to enter the treadmill of paying sky-high rents? As you know, there's a huge wealth gap between people of color and whites, especially between Black Americans and whites. And many of us here in LA are very concerned about this idea that so many of our smaller homes would just be erased and replaced with super expensive quadruplexes.
Right. That's a question, Gina. Look, the Minneapolis, duplex, triplex, quadruplex idea is coming under criticism as well, because, what do these smart developers do? They just charge almost as much as they would have done for a single family home for one of these super duper energy efficient chef's kitchen, hardwood floor, the usual formula. Look, New York, Boston, certainly Cambridge, where I'm living, rent control is back on the agenda. Rent controls are back on the agenda. There needs to be, strict anti-gentrification policies. Now, again, I've mentioned Cambridge and Berkeley, two of the most progressive authorities in the country. We have got rampant gentrification in Cambridge, and yet Cambridge City Council really pushes the Massachusetts requirement for affordable units in new developments. It really pushes it, but it's still not having anything to do, it's not being effective at slowing down gentrification, when we've got, just next to the coffee shop that I go to, Moderna is right there. And then across the road is Pfizer, and MIT is just down the road, and Harvard. How do you control development in super hot places? That's one of the problems. And many of our cities are becoming superheated. Again, we've got to go back to Harvey. I mean, how do we change that calculus? How do we change the calculus away from, you know, investment vehicle to home? Take a look at Vienna. You know, what's really interesting, if you look at Vancouver, Melbourne, Sydney, Vienna, usually Vienna is actually at the top of the livability scale. You know, most people live in rented properties in Vienna, and many of them are price controlled. Berlin is reintroducing rent controls. This has got to happen. We've got to get back to some form of regulatory approach to housing, because of course that whole notion of belonging and becoming, I mean, nobody can belong at some of the prices that you have in LA, that we have here in Boston, or that you have in Seattle. So yeah, again, strong mayors, housing activist groups, urban planning activist groups, all of these groups, I think, need to come together in coalition to really push for affordability in housing. It's just, it's got to happen.
Thank you.
Hi, Julian. Could you say something about, you said something about having a critique of the Congress for New Urbanism. Could you say a little bit about that?
Hi, Melanie, long time.
Hey, yes, good to see you.
I was thinking Seattle AAG way back in the day.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, a long time ago. Anyway, the Congress for New Urbanism, cookie cutter. It's cookie cutter urbanism in many ways. And, you know, this idea of human scale, if you look at a lot of the places that they've developed, like Seaside, Florida, or I can't remember all of the names of the places, but in many ways, I just find them soulless. Can we actually design place without that concept of social ecology that I mentioned? You know, I showed you the picture of the cookie cutter design and then the street where, you know, where human beings had remodeled the space. So I think in many ways I'm critical of the New Urbanist, Congress for New Urbanism approach, because it seems to me rather inflexible. You know, the designs are, you know, we are the experts. These are the designs that we have trialed and found to be most appropriate. Therefore, you should be fine living in them. Well, most new urbanist communities are anything but diverse in socioeconomic or racial or any other terms. So
do you like their idea of the densification around public transportation?
Oh, yes, yes. I mean, some of the principles, yes, of course. I mean, transit-oriented development. I mean, and some of these are not just CNU or new urbanist principles. These are just principles of good planning. But yeah, I'm not knocking them on some of the things. All I'm saying is that in terms of their approach is very expert-led, and it's not bottom up. And CNU has relied on a sort of who's who group of urbanists to develop their ideas.
I had a comment on the affordability issue and rent control, and then a corollary policy suggestion, which I want to hear if you agree with or not. So my comment is that currently we split the tenants into affordable, let's say, and market, right? And roughly in New York City, I mean, I don't know, in other places, it's about 85 to 15. So 15% are affordable, and then I would put quote unquote affordable, and then the others are markets. Okay, now this, what we call affordable, and the rent control is a portion of that, forces the affordable tenants, which are usually very low income, to pay a third of their income. Now imagine how huge that percentage is into rent. And to add insult to injury, even that low rent that they pay is still much higher than the costs that the landlord incurs in order to maintain their apartment. So they're still priced out, even the rent control ones. Now let's go to the market. So the market tenants pay enormous rent for, again, the services they get from the landlords. And most of them, of course, they can afford to pay, and then they get fooled. All that there is no, like, they don't suffer from anything, and they do. And so how do we remedy that? One, so and the mechanism through which we provide affordability is through tax exemptions, right? That's the only mechanism I've seen that affordable housing gets built. Oh, I'm going to build it. The developer says, I'm going to build it if you give me tax breaks. When we do that, it costs actually the New York City as a city more, and the New York State as well, because it's a state city thing. It costs more to provide affordable housing that way than if the city went into the market and bought or rented the apartments outright at market prices and gave it to the poor tenants. So you see that we have a perverse incentive cemented, and that costs us more. It's a double and triple whammy. Now that's the first part of my question. Now, if you want to comment,
Yanis,
and then I want to touch on canceling the rent, because that's one way that's proposed to deal with that.
Right. Yeah, Yanis, look, affordability is usually predicated around what's called the area median income. And, you know, look, area median income, I mean, you know, who's included in that? I mean, if we take the area median income for Boston, you know, that's going to rule out a lot of people in the poorest neighborhoods. You know, it won't be affordable to them. We need a much more local, or we need some other way of calculating affordability. I think this is at the base of all of this. And I'm not familiar with all the machinations, obviously, in New York City, but it seems to me obvious we need a better way of calculating affordability than an area median income, which just papers over and comes out with an aggregate income, which, you know, for many people is just still off the charts, you know. So I'll take one more question, if anybody else is interested.
I have a question. So I'm really intrigued by applying the concept of the spatial justice to looking at food environments. And in the food environment literature, while sort of the concept of spatial justice is implied, there's very few academic papers that really explicitly use that framework. So I wanted to know if you're familiar with work in the food environment, the built food environment, that's more explicit with that concept. And then you don't have to answer that question, but I think what I wanted to know from your experience and observations, like through your career, what are some trends you've seen in thinking about food environments in a just way? So the built food environment, how people are accessing food, and if planners are beginning to think about spatial justice in terms of food access.
Yeah, great question. I mean, so urban agriculture is really relatively recent to urban planners. I mean, it wasn't really till 2000 that the first article in the Journal of the American Planning Association came out asking why is urban agriculture a stranger to urban planners? Because urban planners, you know, they deal with food retail environments and, you know, that kind of thing, but sort of agriculture had never been important. But now, I mean, we at Tufts, we do a dual degree. So you can get a degree from my department and the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. So it's a dual degree, very popular. We are kicking out now food systems planners. That's what they're calling themselves. And they're getting jobs. Most cities now have offices of urban agriculture. And I have to say, because food insecurity is so much to the fore at the moment, issues of equity and social justice and access in food systems seem to be being taken up by most of these mayoral officers of urban agriculture. Most of my students, I mean, my food justice class is by far and away the most popular class. Oh, and I've got to tell you something. I got 4.8 for class and instructor. It's the best results I've ever had in 20 years teaching. And it was the first class entirely behind a Zoom lens. What does this say? Students don't like me in person, but they like to see me behind the screen. I think this is, no, I say this because look, food justice is a really, really popular topic with students. Food issues generally, but food justice. And so, I mean, so spatial justice can operate at many levels. I mean, you know, spatial injustice could be said to be food deserts, and that these food deserts are spatially oriented towards, you know, lower income neighborhoods. But don't ever just think of food deserts as being, you know, some sort of economic malfunction. Read Nate McClintock's chapter in Cultivating Food Justice, which I think is going to go down as a classic in urban political ecology. He looks at the Oakland food desert, and he really just shows you how it's the result of basically white supremacist urban planning. So spatial injustice is, I think, a phenomenon in terms of access to food spaces, but it's being re-theorized and being seen in more practical terms through the, you know, COVID-induced huge rise in food insecurities. You know, yeah, I think that's where I would leave that.
Thank you so much.
But there are great opportunities, though, because of this greater awareness. Just as, you know, during the COVID pandemic, people have discovered public spaces. They've discovered that it's nicer to see streets with not so many cars. How do we as planners and politicians mainstream and capitalize on these public desires? And how do we use the horrific increase in food insecurity in a wealthy state like Massachusetts? How do we use that to ensure that we are more food secure? Well, part of it is through electing mayors like Councillor Wu, who I urge you, and if, yeah, I urge you to go to her website and look at her food justice agenda. It is amazing. It really is. You will not see another, it's not a food action plan, it's a food justice agenda. With all that implies, and it is really, in fact, I mean, if somebody could put the link up in the chat box, I think it's michelleforboston.com, and then you scroll down. She's also got a Green New Deal for Boston. She's putting together, I think, a really, really progressive agenda, and she will, if elected, I think, rewrite the narrative of Boston, because that's another really important thing at the moment. City narratives are usually, you know, Eurocentric or white-centric. For someone like Michelle Wu, she can develop a new narrative for Boston that won't be all about Fenway Park and Cheers. It might be about something slightly more integrative. Oh yeah, so Cole has just put it up. Michelle for Boston, yeah. Seriously, folks, you know, let's do all we can to get this woman elected, because, you know, if she does half the things included in that food justice agenda, we in Boston will be in a great space, and we will have a model for other cities around the country. That's the really important thing. Okay, time for a beer, people. I started this day at 9:15 speaking to people like yourselves in Helsinki, Finland. This is one of the upsides of this horrific situation we're in, is that you can be lecturing to, I've done Sao Paulo, Helsinki, yeah, world's your oyster. Last question, which city is that behind me?
Is it Toronto?
It is Toronto, yeah, yeah. I'll leave you with this thought. And I didn't take this picture, but I love this picture because in that one picture, you have two ends of human evolution. You have fire and the global 21st century skyline, two ends of human evolution. And it reminds me, it's a great way of centering myself at the beginning of the day when I start zooming, basically. So great speaking to you all. And, please email me if you didn't get a question or time to get your question. I'm more than happy to answer emails.
Thank you so much, Julian. And we will be posting the recording on where we archive our webinars from the series. And really, again, though, just appreciate your warmth and your willingness to talk and engage in these such diverse questions and diverse topics. Really helps out everyone here. And good example of that contact theory for our academic disciplines, how we need to talk to folks outside of our discipline so much more.
Well, yeah, it's a disciplinary concept, but also contact theory is, it's about, human beings realizing that we're human beings, with different phenotypes, different sexualities, different proclivities. So contact theory, I think, works on many, many levels. And I hadn't actually thought about it as being that kind of intersectional level between different academics in different disciplines. Yeah.
Well, I think this session certainly shows how useful it is and how diverse the audience is and how much we're all learning. So thank you so much again. And we look forward to folks joining us for our next Sandbox webinar with Dr. Karen Spiller, February 26th, I believe. 25th? Oh, good.
25th, yeah. It's on the 21-day, 21-day racial equity habit building challenge. And so this is going to be sort of kicking off the 21-day racial equity habit building challenge in April. And she's going to give a talk before the challenge as well as after. So I hope you can all join us.
Right.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you.